Mrs. Carter has an answer for everything. Everyone at Jefferson Middle School knew one thing about Mrs. Carter. She always had an answer. It did not matter if the question made sense, if it was ridiculous, or if it sounded like it came from someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Mrs. Carter had an answer for everything. And somehow, it was always funnier than the question. It started one ordinary Tuesday morning when Jordan raised his hand. "Mrs. Carter," he asked, "what if I miss the test because I get abducted by aliens?" Without even looking up from her desk, Mrs. Carter replied, "Then tell them to beam you back by third period because the test is still due." The classroom exploded into laughter. Jordan blinked. "You wouldn't excuse alien abduction?" Mrs. Carter folded her arms. "Jordan, if extraterrestrials find you and decide you're worth taking, I'll consider that your first accomplishment all year." "But no, the test is not excused." The class hollered. Then Marcus raised his hand. "What if my dog eats my homework?" Mrs. Carter nodded calmly. "Then your dog will be presenting it in front of the class tomorrow." Students screamed with laughter. Then another student spoke up. "What if my grandma dies?" Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. "Again?" The room lost it. The student slowly lowered his hand. Then came the parents. A mother stormed into the classroom after school. "Mrs. Carter," she snapped, "my son said you gave him detention for talking during class." "I did," Mrs. Carter replied. "Well, my son talks at home all the time, and we don't punish him for it." Mrs. Carter smiled politely. "Well, ma'am, if he starts solving equations at your house, I won't assign homework for that either." The hallway erupted from students listening nearby. Another parent once emailed her, "My daughter says she should receive full credit for trying her best." Mrs. Carter emailed back, "And I should receive Teacher of the Year for surviving this conversation, but here we are." By Friday, the students had turned asking ridiculous questions into a game. "Mrs. Carter," Jordan said one morning, "what if a tornado picks up the school bus?" "Then submit your assignment before liftoff." "Mrs. Carter, what if I break my arm?" "Then use the other one." "What if both arms break?" "Then I'll allow dictation." "What if I lose my voice?" "Then blink your answers in Morse code." Jordan threw his pencil down. "Do you have an answer for everything?" Mrs. Carter smiled and adjusted her glasses. "Yes." Jordan squinted. "What if you don't?" Mrs. Carter leaned forward. "Then I make one up with confidence, and none of you question it." The class erupted. Even the principal once walked in and asked, "Mrs. Carter, how do you keep control of this room?" She smiled. "Fear, sarcasm, and classroom management strategies." Jordan whispered to Marcus, "She definitely meant mostly fear." Marcus nodded. "Mostly fear." From that day on, students stopped trying to outsmart Mrs. Carter. Not because they respected her, not because they feared her, but because every time they tried, she embarrassed them in 4K in front of the entire class, and somehow they loved every second of it. Mrs. Carter stood at the front of the classroom with her arms crossed and a clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. The room quieted as she cleared her throat. "Listen carefully," she said in a stern voice. "Attendance at Saturday's school performance is mandatory. Anyone who does not attend will write a 10-page paper by Monday morning." A wave of groans spread across the classroom. Students slumped in their chairs, muttering complaints under their breath. Some stared at one another in disbelief, while others shook their heads dramatically. Then Jordan slowly raised his hand from the back of the room. Mrs. Carter sighed heavily. "Yes, Jordan?" Jordan sat up straight and asked, "What if someone can't come because they're in the hospital?" Mrs. Carter barely hesitated. Then they better notify me beforehand. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. Then he raised his hand again. And what if they're in a coma? The classroom exploded into laughter. Students bent over their desks, some nearly falling out of their chairs as they laughed. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes and waited for the noise to settle. "If you are in a coma, Mr. Jordan," she said sharply, "then I suppose the paper will be due when you wake up." Jordan stared at her for a moment. "Dang," he muttered. The room laughed again, but Jordan lifted his hand once more. Mrs. Carter groaned. "What now?" Jordan leaned forward with a completely serious expression. "Well, if I was in a coma," he began, "and I was in 6th grade when it happened." He paused dramatically, making the entire class lean in. "I simply would not wake up until I turned 30. The room erupted louder than before. Students pounded on their desks. One girl laughed so hard she covered her face. Another student nearly slid out of his chair. Mrs. Carter blinked in disbelief. "What?" Jordan folded his arms confidently. "Think about it," he said. "No homework, no school, no chores, no responsibilities. I'd stay asleep until adulthood." Marcus, the boy sitting next to him, laughed and said, "Bro said he's hibernating through puberty." Another student shouted from across the room, "He'd wake up with a mortgage and back pain." Jordan pointed at him proudly. "Exactly. Skip all the awkward years." Mrs. Carter pinched the bridge of her nose, clearly regretting every life choice that had brought her to this moment. "Jordan," she said slowly, "that may be the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my entire teaching career." Jordan shrugged and leaned back in his chair. "Work smarter, not harder." Mrs. Carter turned away, muttering under her breath, "Lord, give me strength." Jordan leaned over and whispered to Marcus, "If I wake up at 30 and she's still teaching, ask her if the paper is still due." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I got you." And somehow, against all odds, the class laughed even harder. Mrs. Carter folded her arms tightly and stared at Jordan while the laughter slowly died down around the room. She adjusted her glasses and gave him a look so serious that even Marcus stopped laughing. "Well, Mr. Jordan," she said calmly, "if you choose to remain in your coma until age 30, then every single assignment you missed will be waiting right beside your hospital bed when you wake up." The classroom instantly lost it. Jordan's smile faded. He blinked twice. "Wait, all of it?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Every worksheet, every quiz, every homework packet, every group project, every essay, every extra credit assignment, 30 years worth if necessary." The class burst into wild laughter again. Marcus nearly fell out of his chair. Jordan sat frozen, trying to process what she had just said. "You mean to tell me," he whispered, "I'd wake up fighting for my life and still have math homework?" Mrs. Carter gave a single nod. "You would have oxygen tubes in your nose and a pencil in your hand." The class screamed with laughter. Then Mrs. Carter leaned forward with a smirk. "And after that," she added, "you will march right back into this classroom as a 30-year-old 6th grader." The room exploded louder than before. One student shouted, "Bro gonna be driving to middle school." Another yelled, "Imagine being 30 asking your mom to sign your field trip form." Marcus wiped tears from his eyes. "Bro gonna have a beard in the lunch line." Jordan grabbed his chest dramatically. "A 30-year-old 6th grader?" he cried. "I'd be paying taxes and asking to use the bathroom." Then Jordan paused and shook his head. "Actually, never mind. I wouldn't even be paying taxes." The room quieted slightly. Jordan pointed to himself confidently. Because who is hiring a 30-year-old sixth grader? The classroom exploded again. Jordan stood up dramatically and continued, I'd walk into a job interview and they'd ask for my resume. I'd be like, well, ma'am, I'm currently in middle school, but I got perfect attendance since waking up from my coma. Students were pounding their desks, laughing. Jordan kept going. And if my mom decides she don't want a grown man living in her house no more, he threw his hands in the air, I'm homeless. The room roared. Marcus was gasping for air. Bro gonna be under a bridge doing homework. Another student shouted, living in a box with a backpack and math book. Jordan nodded dramatically. I'd be on the sidewalk like, can someone spare change? I need lunch money and notebook paper. Even Mrs. Carter had to turn away to hide her laughter. Jordan pointed at her. So no, ma'am, your plan has ruined my entire future. Mrs. Carter wiped her eyes and regained composure. Well, perhaps, she said, that should motivate you to avoid the coma altogether. Jordan dropped into his chair and folded his arms. Fine, he muttered. I'll just go to the performance. Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. Excellent choice. Jordan leaned toward Marcus and whispered, This woman just bullied me into consciousness. The classroom erupted one final time. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms and slowly turned toward Jordan, her eyebrow raised so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. Jordan, she said, before you go around accusing people of bullying you, let me explain what bullying actually is. Jordan leaned back in his chair dramatically. Yes, ma'am, he muttered. Mrs. Carter walked to the front of the room and grabbed a marker. She wrote one word on the board in giant letters, bullying. Then underneath it she wrote, not bullying. The class immediately sat up. Now, class, she said, pointing at the board like she was teaching the most important lesson of the year. Bullying is when someone repeatedly harms, threatens, intimidates, or mistreats another person. Jordan nodded slowly. Mrs. Carter pointed at the second side. Not bullying is when a teacher tells you the consequences of your own ridiculous choices. The room burst into laughter. Jordan pointed to himself. So threatening me with 30 years of homework is not bullying? Mrs. Carter shook her head. No, that is called accountability. The class hollered. Jordan folded his arms. What if someone embarrasses you in front of everybody? Mrs. Carter nodded thoughtfully. That can be bullying. Unless, she said, turning toward him, you embarrassed yourself first by announcing your plan to medically hibernate until age 30. The class exploded. Marcus merely slid out of his chair laughing. Jordan looked around the room. Y'all are supposed to be on my side. Mrs. Carter continued. Bullying is not being corrected, being told no, facing consequences, or hearing something you don't like. She paused and pointed directly at Jordan. And it especially is not when your teacher simply refuses to participate in your nonsense. Jordan placed a hand on his chest dramatically. My nonsense? Mrs. Carter nodded. Yes, your nonsense. Jordan stood up. So if I told my mom you bullied me? Mrs. Carter interrupted immediately. I would tell her you tried to avoid school by entering a voluntary coma. The room erupted. Jordan sat back down instantly. Okay, fair enough. Mrs. Carter smiled. Excellent. Glad we understand each other. Jordan leaned toward Marcus and whispered, Man, she got an answer for everything. Marcus nodded. She got teacher DLC unlocked. Mrs. Carter pointed without even turning around. I heard that. The class screamed with laughter. Jordan shook his head. She got super hearing too? Nah, we're cooked. Even Mrs. Carter laughed this time. Mrs. Carter had one flaw. just one. She always had an answer for everything. She always had a comeback for every excuse. She always had a solution to every problem. But despite all her wisdom, sarcasm, and classroom management strategies, Mrs. Carter could never make it to work on time. Every single morning, contract time was 7:30, and every single morning, Mrs. Carter was sliding into the parking lot at 7:42 with coffee in one hand, her teacher bag in the other, and absolutely no shame on her face. The students noticed, the teachers noticed, the front office noticed. Even the crossing guard once looked at her and said, "Running behind again, huh?" Mrs. Carter adjusted her glasses and replied, "Time is a social construct." Soon the administration noticed too, and worst of all, Mr. Bumblebee noticed. Mr. Bumblebee was the assistant principal, and somehow he always appeared whenever Mrs. Carter was late. No one knew where he came from. He just appeared. Some said he could smell tardiness. Others believed he lived in the parking lot. Jordan claimed he slept hanging upside down in the office like a bat waiting for late staff. Whatever the truth was, Mr. Bumblebee was always on Mrs. Carter's back. One morning, Mrs. Carter pulled into the parking lot and looked up in horror. The first bell rang. Her eyes widened. No, 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 no! She grabbed her coffee, teacher bag, lunchbox, and laptop all at once and sprinted toward the building like an action movie hero. Students watched in amazement. Is that Mrs. Carter running? She's in survival mode. Mrs. Carter dashed through the hallway, heels clicking like machine gun fire against the floor. Then suddenly, she froze. At the end of the hallway stood Mr. Bumblebee, clipboard in hand, watching, waiting. Jordan whispered dramatically, "Oh no!" Marcus gasped. He found her. Mrs. Carter quickly ducked behind the vending machine. Mr. Bumblebee scanned the hallway suspiciously. Mrs. Carter peeked around the corner. Then she whispered to herself, "I didn't survive student teaching for this." The second bell rang. Mr. Bumblebee's head snapped up. Mrs. Carter made her move. She darted low across the hallway, crouch running past classroom doors like she was in a spy movie. Students inside classrooms were pressing against windows watching. "She's making a break for it. Go, Mrs. Carter. Don't let him see you." She slid into her classroom just as Mr. Bumblebee turned the corner. He stopped, squinted, then narrowed his eyes. Mrs. Carter sat perfectly still at her desk, breathing hard, pretending to grade papers. Mr. Bumblebee stepped into the doorway. "Mrs. Carter?" She smiled sweetly. "Yes." He stared suspiciously. "Did you just get here?" She blinked innocently. "No, sir, I've been here." Jordan whispered loudly from his desk. "She literally Naruto ran down the hallway." Mrs. Carter kicked his chair. Jordan yelped. Mr. Bumblebee crossed his arms. "Then why are you sweating?" Mrs. Carter calmly took a sip of coffee. "Passion for education." The room exploded. Mr. Bumblebee sighed. "I'm watching you." Mrs. Carter smiled. "And I'm watching the clock." But eventually Mr. Bumblebee had enough. One afternoon he called her into his office. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "your tardiness has become a concern." Mrs. Carter folded her hands politely. "I hear your concern." "No, I mean seriously, you cannot continue arriving late." Mrs. Carter nodded thoughtfully. Then she smiled. "Well then, Mr. Bumblebee, I suppose I'll start using my personal days." He blanked. "What?" Mrs. Carter leaned back proudly. "You see, I have worked very hard to accumulate my personal time." Mr. Bumblebee stared nervously. And if my 12-minute tardiness is such an issue, she continued, then every time someone addresses it, I'll simply take a half day. His jaw dropped. You can't be serious? Mrs. Carter smiled wider. Oh, I'm very serious. And from that day forward, every time Mr. Bumblebee emailed her about being late, Mrs. Carter mysteriously submitted a half-day request. The office panicked. The secretaries whispered, "Don't mention her tardiness. She'll leave before lunch. We lost her 3 times last week." One day, Jordan noticed her packing up at 11 o'clock. "Mrs. Carter, where are you going?" She zipped her bag calmly. "Home." "Why?" She pointed toward the office. "Mr. Bumblebee brought up my arrival time this morning." Jordan gasped. "So, because he said you were late? You're leaving early?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes." Jordan blinked. "That makes absolutely no sense." Mrs. Carter pointed at him. "And neither does complaining about 12 minutes when I have 87 unused personal hours." Marcus whispered, "She weaponized PTO." Jordan stared in awe. "You're fighting administration with benefits?" Mrs. Carter adjusted her glasses proudly. "Work smarter, not harder." By the end of the semester, nobody mentioned her tardiness anymore. Not because she improved, but because every time they did, they lost her for half the day. Jordan leaned toward Marcus and whispered, "She got an answer for authority too?" Marcus nodded. "She's unstoppable." Mrs. Carter, without looking up, replied, "I heard that." The boys jumped. Jordan shook his head. She really got super hearing. Mrs. Carter had many talents. She could control a classroom with one look. She could humble a student with one sentence. She could answer any ridiculous question with alarming speed. But above all else, Mrs. Carter believed in one sacred principle: protecting her peace. And nothing disturbed Mrs. Carter's peace more than one phrase. "Can you cover another teacher's class?" The moment she heard those words, her entire mood changed. Her smile disappeared, her eye twitched, her soul left her body for approximately 3 seconds. One morning, the secretary poked her head into the room. "Mrs. Carter?" Mrs. Carter looked up suspiciously. "Yes?" "We're short-staffed today. Would you mind covering Miss Thompson's class during your planning period?" The room went silent. Jordan whispered, "Oh no." Marcus grabbed his chest. "She's about to crash out." Mrs. Carter slowly set her coffee down, then folded her hands, then stood up, then calmly walked to her computer. The secretary blinked. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Carter smiled politely. "Submitting a personal day." The secretary froze. "What?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes. If I must lose my planning period, then I shall lose the entire day." The classroom exploded. Jordan nearly fell out of his chair. "You take off if they ask you to cover?" Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. "Absolutely." Marcus stared in disbelief. "That's insane." Mrs. Carter pointed at him. "No, Marcus, what's insane is asking me to do 2 jobs for 1 paycheck." The class lost it. The secretary panicked. "Mrs. Carter, wait. No, we can find someone else." Mrs. Carter continued typing. "Too late. Request submitted." The secretary sprinted off, yelling, "Never mind! She's doing the thing again!" Word spread quickly throughout the school. Soon, every teacher knew. Never ask Mrs. Carter to cover, because if you did, she would simply leave. One afternoon, Jordan saw her packing her bag at 9:15. He blinked. "Mrs. Carter, why are you leaving? School just started." She zipped her purse. "They asked me to cover 3rd period." Jordan stared. So you took the whole day off over one class? Mrs. Carter nodded. Yes. Marcus squinted. That feels dramatic. Mrs. Carter adjusted her glasses. No, Marcus. What's dramatic is expecting me to babysit 30 extra children during the only free time I have to maintain my sanity. The class hollered. Jordan shook his head. You really don't play about your planning period. Mrs. Carter pointed at the board. Planning period is not free time. Planning period is survival time. Marcus whispered, She stands on business. Jordan nodded. She stands on PTO. Later that week, Mr. Bumblebee approached her in the hallway. Mrs. Carter, we noticed every time we ask you to cover, you mysteriously use a personal day. Mrs. Carter smiled sweetly. Correct. He blinked. You don't think that's excessive? Mrs. Carter leaned forward. You don't think asking me to give up my planning period is excessive? Mr. Bumblebee stared, then sighed. Fair enough. From that day on, whenever the office needed coverage, the staff whispered, Ask literally anybody else. And Mrs. Carter sat peacefully in her classroom during planning, sipping coffee like a queen who had won another battle. Jordan leaned toward Marcus and whispered, She treats boundaries like commandments. Marcus nodded solemnly. She got PTO for every situation. Mrs. Carter, without looking up, replied, And don't you forget it. The boys jumped. Jordan sighed. She heard that too? Mrs. Carter always acted annoyed when students fought. She would sigh dramatically, rub her forehead, talk about how exhausting it was, complain about paperwork, threaten everyone with suspension. But the students didn't know. Mrs. Carter had a secret, a terrible, deeply unprofessional secret. She loved when bad students got expelled, not because she enjoyed seeing children fail, but because, in her words, every classroom has at least 3 people actively lowering the average IQ. And whenever one of them got removed, Mrs. Carter celebrated like it was Christmas morning. Even worse, when fights broke out, Mrs. Carter didn't just break them up. She placed bets. One afternoon, Jordan accidentally discovered this secret. 2 students were arguing in the hallway. The crowd gathered. Phones came out. Everybody started chanting, Fight! 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 Mrs. Carter stepped into the hallway. Jordan expected her normal speech, her normal sigh, her normal disappointed lecture. Instead, she leaned over to the teacher beside her and whispered, I got $5 on Red Hoodie. Jordan froze. What? Marcus turned slowly. No way. Mrs. Carter folded her arms calmly. Blue backpack has poor balance. His stance is weak. Jordan stared in horror. Are you analyzing them? Mrs. Carter nodded seriously. Footwork matters, Jordan. The boys squared up. Mrs. Carter whispered under her breath, Come on, Red Hoodie. Don't embarrass me. Jordan grabbed his chest. This is insane. Then suddenly, Mr. Bumblebee walked around the corner. Mrs. Carter immediately switched personalities. Stop this violence right now! She yelled dramatically. The hallway went silent. Mr. Bumblebee nodded proudly. Excellent intervention, Mrs. Carter. She smiled sweetly. Thank you. I cared deeply about conflict resolution. The second she walked away, she leaned toward the teacher next to her. He almost sold the combo. I was nervous. Jordan's jaw dropped. Later that month, one of the worst students in school got expelled. The next day, Jordan walked into class and froze. Mrs. Carter had decorations up, balloons, cupcakes, music playing softly. A banner across the whiteboard read, Happy Peaceful Classroom Day. Jordan blinked repeatedly. What is this? Mrs. Carter smiled brightly. We're celebrating. Marcus looked confused. Celebrating what? Mrs. Carter took a deep breath. Growth, healing, improved hallway energy, better academic futures. Jordan narrowed his eyes. You're celebrating because Deshaun got expelled, aren't you? Mrs. Carter slowly sipped her coffee. I can neither confirm nor deny. Jordan pointed at the cupcakes. They say, rest in peace to classroom chaos. Mrs. Carter shrugged. Decorations were on sale. Marcus whispered, she turned his expulsion into a holiday. Jordan nodded. She's sick. Mrs. Carter clapped her hands happily. Everyone take a cupcake. Today we honor silence, productivity, and completed assignments. Jordan stared. You are not supposed to be this happy. Mrs. Carter adjusted her glasses. Jordan, when disruptive energy leaves the building, peace enters. Marcus whispered, she definitely threw a party. Jordan nodded. She absolutely threw a party. Mrs. Carter passed out cupcakes. And if 2 more leave before winter break, she smiled, we may have pizza. The class lost it. Jordan whispered, Mrs. Carter is actually evil. Mrs. Carter, without looking up, replied, no, Jordan. She smiled, I'm efficient. Mrs. Carter has an answer for everything. The replacement. When the most disruptive student in the school was finally expelled, Mrs. Carter celebrated like she had just won the lottery. She decorated the classroom, passed out cupcakes, played peaceful music during warm-ups, and for one glorious week, she knew peace. But peace never lasts forever, because one Monday morning, Mr. Bumblebee walked into her classroom smiling, and anytime administration smiled that hard, it meant disaster. Good morning, Mrs. Carter, he said cheerfully. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. What do you want? Mr. Bumblebee handed her a folder. We have a new student joining your class today. The entire room went silent. Mrs. Carter stared at the folder, then slowly looked up. A replacement? Mr. Bumblebee smiled. Yes. Mrs. Carter blinked twice, then whispered, no. Jordan leaned toward Marcus. She's about to lose it. Marcus nodded. She's buffering. Mr. Bumblebee kept smiling. He'll be filling the seat of the student we lost last week. Mrs. Carter grabbed her chest dramatically. Lost? Lost? She stood up suddenly. Sir, we did not lose him. He was removed by force. The class exploded. Mr. Bumblebee sighed. Well, the new student will be here in 5 minutes. The second he left, Mrs. Carter dropped into her chair. No. Jordan raised his hand. Mrs. Carter, are you okay? She looked up slowly. No, Jordan, I am in mourning. The class left. Marcus frowned. For what? Mrs. Carter stood dramatically. For the peace we once had. And then, without another word, she walked to her closet and pulled out black decorations. Jordan blinked. Why do you have funeral decorations at school? Mrs. Carter ignored him. She began hanging black streamers around the room. She placed fake candles on her desk. She dimmed the lights. Then she pulled out an all-black cardigan from her bag and put it on. The room erupted. Ain't no way. She dressed for a funeral? Bro, she is grieving. Jordan stared in disbelief. Mrs. Carter, what are you doing? She turned dramatically. We are gathering here today. She placed a hand over her heart. to remember the peace this classroom once knew. Marcus wiped tears, laughing. You are so extra. Mrs. Carter pointed at the empty desk. That desk was once a symbol of silence. Then she looked upward. And now it shall be occupied once more. Jordan could barely breathe. You're acting like somebody died. Mrs. Carter nodded solemnly. My freedom did. Then the door opened, and in walked the new student. Everyone froze. Mrs. Carter slowly turned toward him, still dressed in black. The boy looked around nervously. He glanced at the decorations. Did somebody die? Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. Yes. The room lost it. The boy froze. Who? Mrs. Carter pointed at herself. My sanity. Jordan collapsed onto his desk laughing. Mr. Bumblebee poked his head back in. Mrs. Carter, why are you dressed like that? She dabbed fake tears from her eye. I am mourning this classroom's future. The new student whispered, Should I come back later? Marcus shouted, Run while you can. Mrs. Carter sighed dramatically and sat at her desk, then looked the new student dead in the eye. Welcome to class. She pointed to the seat. Please don't make me regret this. The new student slowly sat down, terrified. Jordan leaned toward Marcus and whispered, She really held a funeral for classroom peace. Marcus nodded. She's mentally unstable. Mrs. Carter, without missing a beat, replied, And yet I'm still employed. The class screamed. Mrs. Carter loved many things. Quiet classrooms, completed homework, personal days, and students getting expelled. But there was one sound that brought her more joy than anything else. It was hearing a student say, My family might be moving. The first time Mrs. Carter heard it, she nearly dropped her coffee. Jordan casually mentioned it during independent work. Yeah, he said, shrugging. My mom said we might be moving this summer. Mrs. Carter froze. She slowly turned and whispered, Moving? Jordan blinked. Yeah. Mrs. Carter stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. The whole class stared. You're leaving? She asked. Jordan shrugged again. Maybe. Mrs. Carter grabbed her chest dramatically. Oh my goodness. Marcus squinted. Why do you look excited? Mrs. Carter ignored him. Instead, she rushed to her desk and pulled out a notebook. Jordan frowned. What are you doing? Mrs. Carter clicked her pen. Planning. Planning what? Jordan asked. Mrs. Carter looked up with tears in her eyes. Your farewell gala. The room exploded. A what? Marcus nearly collapsed laughing. Jordan stared in horror. My what? Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. Yes. She began writing furiously. Elegant venue, black and gold balloons, chocolate fountain. Jordan stood up. Why are you planning a party? Mrs. Carter gasped. Jordan, if you are departing from my educational care, we will honor the occasion properly. Marcus grabbed his stomach, laughing. She's celebrating your departure. Mrs. Carter pointed dramatically. No, I am commemorating his transition. Jordan looked offended. You are way too happy about this. Mrs. Carter ignored him and kept writing. String quartet, shrimp platter, red carpet entrance. Jordan blinked. Why is this fancy? Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. Because this will be a black tie affair. The class lost it. Marcus shouted, She's throwing you a rich people goodbye party. Mrs. Carter nodded. Formal attire required. No jeans, no sneakers. Jordan stared in disbelief. You planned a dress code? Mrs. Carter pointed at him. You are the guest of honor. Jordan shook his head. This is insane. Mrs. Carter continued mumbling to herself. We'll need a photographer, maybe fireworks. Jordan yelled, Fireworks? Mrs. Carter nodded. If budget allows. The next day, Jordan walked into class and froze. A giant poster hung on the wall. Farewell Gala for Jordan, celebrating new beginnings. Jordan screamed, Ain't no way! Mrs. Carter stood proudly in front of it. We have begun preparations, Jordan pointed. You put my name on it? Mrs. Carter nodded. And RSVP sheets are by the door. Marcus was crying, laughing. She sent invitations? Mrs. Carter smiled. Teachers only for now. We don't want overcrowding. Jordan shouted, I'm not even gone yet. Mrs. Carter shrugged. We're manifesting. 1 week later, Jordan walked in smiling. Good news, everybody. My mom said we're not moving after all. The room went silent. Mrs. Carter froze. She slowly lowered her cassie. Excuse me? Jordan grinned. We're staying. Mrs. Carter stared blankly for 5 full seconds. Then she calmly walked to the poster, ripped it down, crumpled it, and whispered, Cancel the violinist. Marcus collapsed. Jordan laughed. You were really planning that party. Mrs. Carter sat down heavily. I lost deposits. Jordan blinked. You put money down? Mrs. Carter stared at the ceiling. Never promise me joy and take it away again. Then Jordan smiled wider. Oh, and there's more. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. My parents said even if we moved, they didn't want to take me out of your class. The room went silent again. Mrs. Carter blinked slowly. What? Jordan grinned proudly. They said they like you too much. Mrs. Carter stared in horror. So they got a zone variance. The entire classroom erupted. Marcus fell out of his chair. Jordan pointed proudly. They made sure I could stay in your class no matter what. Mrs. Carter grabbed her chest. No. Jordan smiled. Yes. Mrs. Carter slowly sank into her chair. You mean to tell me... She stared at the ceiling. Even geography cannot save me? Jordan nodded. My parents said I belong here, Mrs. Carter whispered. This is my villain origin story. Marcus was wheezing. Jordan smiled and said, Looks like we're together forever. Mrs. Carter stood up dramatically. Class dismissed. I need bereavement leave. One Monday morning, the school felt different. It was too quiet, too peaceful, and too calm. Mrs. Carter walked into the building slowly, narrowing her eyes. Something was wrong, very wrong. Jordan noticed immediately and asked, Mrs. Carter, why do you keep looking around like that? She whispered, Because something feels off. Marcus blinked and asked, What do you mean? Mrs. Carter slowly turned and said, I have not been stopped, questioned, monitored, emailed, or stared at all morning. The room went silent. Then Jordan gasped, Oh my goodness, where's Mr. Bumblebee? Mrs. Carter froze. The whole class froze. Everyone slowly looked toward the hallway. There was no clipboard, no suspicious lurking, no random pop-ins, and no surprise observations. Mrs. Carter whispered, He's gone. Jordan blinked. Gone where? Mrs. Carter slowly smiled. I don't know, but wherever he is, I pray he stays there. The class exploded with laughter. By lunch, rumors spread everywhere that Mr. Bumblebee was missing. Nobody knew where he went. Some said he quit. Some said he transferred. Some said he got stuck in a parent meeting and never returned. Jordan ran into class out of breath and shouted, "They said he hasn't been here in 3 days." Mrs. Carter dropped her pen. 3 days? No Mr. Bumblebee for 3 entire days. She stood up immediately. Marcus squinted and asked, "What are you doing?" Mrs. Carter grabbed her purse and said, "Planning." Jordan gasped. "Oh no," Marcus whispered. "She about to do something insane." Mrs. Carter stormed to the whiteboard and wrote in giant letters, "Winter Formal Celebration. Tonight, Teacher's Lounge, black tie event." The room erupted. Jordan screamed, "A what?" Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. "We are celebrating freedom." Marcus blinked. "Because the assistant principal is missing?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes." Jordan stared in disbelief. "That is crazy." Mrs. Carter ignored him and continued writing. "Formal wear required. Buffet refreshments, jazz music, chocolate fountain if budget permits." Jordan shouted, "You keep adding a chocolate fountain to everything." Mrs. Carter pointed dramatically. "Because excellence requires elegance." That afternoon, teachers walked into the lounge and froze. Mrs. Carter had transformed the room completely. Black and silver balloons hung from the ceiling. Streamers covered the walls. A disco ball spun overhead. There were tablecloths, candles, and a DJ speaker. In the center of the room stood Mrs. Carter in a floor-length black dress holding sparkling cider. Jordan peeked through the window and screamed, "Pete, no way!" Marcus shouted, "She really did it!" Mrs. Carter smiled proudly and said, "Welcome, everyone, to the first annual Bumblebee Gone Ball." Teachers burst into laughter. One teacher whispered, "This is so inappropriate." Mrs. Carter nodded and replied, "And yet you came." Music started playing. Teachers began dancing. Someone turned off the lights. Another teacher shouted, "To peace and quiet hallways." Everyone cheered. Mrs. Carter stood on a chair holding her drink high and yelled, "Tonight we celebrate no random walkthroughs." The room roared. "No unscheduled observations." More cheering. "And no passive-aggressive emails." The teachers lost their minds. Jordan whispered to Marcus, "She is definitely getting fired." Marcus nodded. "Absolutely." Then suddenly the lounge door opened. Everyone froze. The music stopped. Mrs. Carter slowly turned. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Bumblebee, alive, holding a folder, still in his work clothes. The room went silent. Mrs. Carter blinked. "Oh." Mr. Bumblebee slowly looked around the room at the decorations, the dancing teachers, and the giant banner that read, "Ding dong, the bee is gone." He narrowed his eyes. Mrs. Carter slowly stepped off her chair. "Well," Jordan whispered, "she's cooked." Mr. Bumblebee crossed his arms and said, "Mrs. Carter." She smiled nervously. "Yes." He pointed at the banner. "What exactly is this?" Mrs. Carter paused and then smiled. "A staff morale event." The teachers burst into laughter. Mr. Bumblebee sighed deeply. "I leave for one conference," Mrs. Carter whispered. "You were only at a conference?" He nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Carter slowly turned toward the teachers and said, "Take everything down." Jordan screamed with laughter. Marcus fell into the wall. Mr. Bumblebee shook his head. "I expect all of you in my office tomorrow." Mrs. Carter sighed and grabbed another drink. Well, at least the night was fun while it lasted. Mrs. Carter always said that the most feared creature in the school only appeared once a year. It did not live in the hallways, hide in the cafeteria, or lurk in the principal's office. It came every spring, and when it arrived, it brought fear to every classroom. Mrs. Carter called it the S-back monster. One morning, she dimmed the lights and stood silently at the front of the room, wearing all black from head to toe. She had on a black cardigan, black shoes, black earrings, and even a black veil clipped into her hair. Jordan stared at her and asked, "Mrs. Carter, why are you dressed like you are going to a funeral?" Mrs. Carter looked at him solemnly and said, "Because I am preparing for what is to come." The class slowly looked around the room and gasped. Black streamers hung from the ceiling, fake candles sat on every table, dark flowers lined the whiteboard, and a giant sign above the board read, "In loving memory of our test scores." Jordan shouted, "Ain't no way!" Marcus pointed toward the reading corner and yelled, "Why is there a fake casket over there?" Mrs. Carter folded her hands and calmly replied, "Symbolism." The room exploded with laughter. Jordan stared in disbelief and asked, "Do you think we are all going to die?" Mrs. Carter nodded and said, "Not physically, spiritually, emotionally, and academically, yes." Then the intercom announced that SBAC testing would begin the next morning. Mrs. Carter gasped dramatically and dropped to one knee. Jordan screamed, "It is here!" Mrs. Carter pointed to the door and yelled, "Lock it!" Marcus ran to shut the door while Jordan slammed the blinds closed. Mrs. Carter handed each student a sharpened pencil and whispered, "Take these. You may not survive, but at least you will be prepared." Jordan held his pencil tightly and asked, "What do we do if the monster attacks?" Mrs. Carter leaned in close and whispered, "Guess C and pray." The next morning, funeral music played softly through the classroom speakers as students entered the room. Mrs. Carter stood at the front holding tissues and said, "Welcome, scholars, to your final days." Jordan shouted, "Please stop saying it like that." Mrs. Carter ignored him and slowly pointed toward the computers. "It is time." As soon as the test began, chaos broke out. One student whispered, "I cannot feel my legs." Another cried, "What even is this question?" Jordan slowly raised his hand and said, "Mrs. Carter, I think I died on number 6. Mrs. Carter nodded and replied, "That happens." Suddenly, a student reached into his pocket and accidentally pulled out his cell phone instead of a pencil. The second Mrs. Carter saw it, she screamed, "No!" The entire class jumped. Jordan nearly fell out of his chair. Marcus yelled, "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Carter sprinted across the room faster than anyone thought possible. She snatched the phone from the student's hand and held it high above her head like it was cursed. "What have you done?" she cried. The student blinked in terror and said, "It was an accident." Mrs. Carter grabbed her chest dramatically and shouted, "An accident? Do you know what happens if they think someone uses a phone during testing?" The room was silent. Jordan whispered, "We'd die?" Mrs. Carter pointed at him and yelled, "Exactly!" Marcus shouted, "We are all getting investigated now." Mrs. Carter paced back and forth in panic. "The testing monitors will descend from the heavens. They will invalidate our scores. They will take my teaching license. They will drag me into the parking lot and beat me with a Scantron." The room exploded laughing. Mrs. Carter pointed toward the ceiling and yelled, "Apologize to Pearson, not to me." Jordan collapsed onto his desk laughing. Mrs. Carter slowly handed the phone back and whispered, "Put that demonic rectangle away before we all perish." The student shoved it back into his backpack. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath, adjusted her funeral veil, and returned to the front of the room saying, "Let us pray the testing spirits did not see." By lunch, the room looked like a battlefield. Students were slumped over desks, staring into space and whispering prayers. Jordan weakly muttered, "The monster got us." Mrs. Carter nodded solemnly and said, "It gets everyone every year." Marcus blinked and asked, "Then how do we survive?" Mrs. Carter smiled, reached under her desk, and pulled out a giant bucket of snacks. She held it high and said, "With Takis and Capri Suns." The room erupted with cheers. Jordan shouted, "She saved us!" Mrs. Carter passed out snacks and said, "Eat and regain your strength. Tomorrow, we battle the writing section." The entire class screamed in terror. Mrs. Carter believed in many things. She believed in classroom management, strong coffee, and speaking her mind. But above all else, Mrs. Carter believed in one sacred gift given to hardworking educators everywhere: paid time off. She did not call it PTO. She called it the Savior. One morning, Jordan walked into class and found Mrs. Carter staring lovingly at her computer screen with tears in her eyes. He blinked and asked, "Mrs. Carter, are you crying?" Mrs. Carter wiped her face dramatically and whispered, "No, Jordan, I am simply overwhelmed by beauty." Jordan slowly walked closer and looked at her screen. On it was her personal leave balance. Jordan squinted and said, "Why are you staring at your PTO hours like that?" Mrs. Carter placed a hand over her heart and said, "Because this, Jordan, is freedom." Marcus leaned over and asked, "How many days do you even have?" Mrs. Carter smiled proudly and whispered, "Enough to disappear for an entire month if necessary." The class erupted. Jordan grabbed his chest and shouted, "A month?" Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. "Do you know how long it took to build this empire?" The class stared as Mrs. Carter slowly stood and looked out the window like she was remembering war. "Years," she whispered. "Years of sacrifice." Jordan blinked. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Carter turned dramatically. "To accumulate PTO, you must avoid taking sick days for 3 years. The room gasped. Marcus whispered, 3 years? Mrs. Carter nodded solemnly. 3 long years. She placed a hand over her chest and continued, "While others stayed home resting, I battled illness in the classroom." Jordan stared in disbelief. "You came to work sick for 3 whole years?" Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. "I taught through fevers, migraines, coughs, congestion, body aches, and strep throat." Marcus asked, "How bad did it get?" Mrs. Carter stared into the distance. "There was one winter I had strep throat, the flu, and no voice all at once." Jordan gasped, "What did you do?" Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. "I taught with a microphone and a fever." The room screamed. Marcus shouted, "You are actually crazy!" Mrs. Carter nodded. "No, Marcus, warriors do not fold when victory is near." Jordan laughed. "You chose PTO over your health?" Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. "Health returns. PTO is earned." Suddenly, the classroom phone rang. Mrs. Carter answered it, and her entire face changed. Jordan whispered, "Uh-oh." Mrs. Carter slowly hung up the phone and stared into space. Marcus asked, "What happened?" Mrs. Carter whispered, "They asked me to attend an after-school professional development meeting." The room gasped. Jordan grabbed his chest. "No." Mrs. Carter slowly stood. "They have pushed me too far." Marcus whispered, "What are you doing?" Mrs. Carter marched to her desk, sat down, and opened her leave request portal. Jordan screamed, "Ain't no way!" Mrs. Carter typed furiously. I was going to save these for spring, but they have forced my hand. Marcus shouted, You're taking off because of one meeting? Mrs. Carter nodded. Correct. They asked for extra. I shall now give less. The class lost their minds. Jordan yelled, You cannot keep doing this. Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. Watch me. The next morning, Jordan walked into class and froze. There was a substitute standing at the front of the room. Jordan screamed, She really did it! Marcus laughed. She called off over a meeting. Just then, the classroom door opened. Mrs. Carter walked in holding Starbucks and sunglasses. Jordan blinked. Wait, why are you here if you took off? Mrs. Carter smiled. I forgot my lunch. Jordan stared in disbelief. You came here on your day off? Mrs. Carter nodded. Yes, but I am not working. Marcus shouted, Then why are you dressed like you're on vacation? Mrs. Carter adjusted her sunglasses and replied, Because mentally, I am in the Bahamas. The room exploded. Jordan whispered, She really worships PTO. Mrs. Carter smiled and placed a hand over her heart. PTO has saved me from burnout, bad meetings, covering classes, and Mr. Bumblebee. It is my refuge and my strength. Marcus shook his head. She talks about PTO like it is a religion. Mrs. Carter nodded solemnly. Because it has performed miracles. Jordan laughed. What miracles? Mrs. Carter smiled and counted on her fingers. It delivered me from staff meetings, parent conferences, trainings, and Mr. Bumblebee. The room erupted laughing. Mrs. Carter slowly walked toward the door and turned dramatically before leaving. Remember this, children. Money comes and goes, but PTO is forever. Then she put her sunglasses back on and walked away into the hallway like a hero riding into the sunset, while the class watched in awe. Mrs. Carter walked into class one Monday morning, glowing in a way the students had never seen before. She wore a brand new outfit, her hair was done perfectly, and she smiled so much that the entire class immediately knew something suspicious was happening. Jordan squinted. Why do you look so happy? Mrs. Carter stood dramatically in front of the room and folded her hands. Class, she said proudly, I have exciting news. The room leaned in. Mrs. Carter smiled. I am getting married. The class exploded. Jordan jumped out of his seat. Ain't no way! Then she smiled proudly again. And after the wedding, I will be moving to London. The room screamed. Jordan blinked rapidly. You're leaving? Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. Yes. Marcus stood up. Wait. You've been married this whole time, though? Mrs. Carter held up a finger. And he owns property in London. The room gasped. Jordan blinked. You found a richer husband? Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. Yes. She placed her hand over her chest dramatically. And I will finally be living the soft life. The room froze. Marcus blinked. The what? Mrs. Carter smiled dreamily. The soft life, Marcus. She stared off into the distance. No more stress, no more grading papers, no more parent emails, no more Mr. Bumblebee. Jordan collapsed laughing. Mrs. Carter continued dramatically. I will spend my mornings drinking tea on a balcony. She placed her hand on her chest. Afternoons shopping in designer boutiques. Then she flipped her hair. And evenings being adored by my wealthy British husband. The class screamed. Jordan grabbed his desk. You are so extra! What happened to your first husband then? The room got quiet. Mrs. Carter froze. Jordan slowly narrowed his eyes. Yeah. Marcus pointed dramatically. Wait a minute. What happened to Mr. Carter? Mrs. Carter stared blankly, then slowly sat down. The class leaned forward. Finally, she sighed deeply. There never was a Mr. Carter. The room exploded. Jordan fell out of his chair. What? Marcus screamed. You've been lying this whole time? Mrs. Carter stood and raised her hands dramatically. Let me explain. Jordan pointed at her. You made up a whole husband? Mrs. Carter sighed. Yes. The room went silent. Marcus blinked. For how long? Mrs. Carter folded her arms proudly. Since I started teaching. The room lost it. Jordan stared in disbelief. I knew something was up. The room turned toward him. Jordan pointed dramatically. Because ain't nobody ever seen Mr. Carter. The room erupted. Marcus grabbed his chest. He right. Jordan kept going. Nobody seen him at open house. He counted on his fingers. Nobody seen him at conferences. Nobody seen him at choir concerts. Nobody seen him at nothing. The room screamed. Jordan pointed accusingly. You kept talking about this man, but he never spawned in real life. Mrs. Carter sighed. Because he was fictional, Jordan. Marcus collapsed laughing. Jordan nodded proudly. I knew it. I've been saying for years that man was a legend. Mrs. Carter rubbed her forehead. Yes, Jordan, you cracked the case. Jordan folded his arms proudly. I'm basically a detective. Mrs. Carter continued. Yes, I created a fake husband because married women are taken more seriously. The room froze. Jordan blinked. What? Mrs. Carter nodded. When people think you have a husband, they assume you're mature, responsible, and established. She leaned forward dramatically. So, I created one. The class screamed. Jordan pointed at her hand. Wait, so the ring? Mrs. Carter held up her hand proudly. Fake? The pictures? Fake, Jordan yelled. The stories about date night? Fake. Marcus screamed. The anniversary posts? Mrs. Carter nodded proudly. Photoshop. The room lost their minds. Jordan grabbed his desk. You created an entire fake life? Mrs. Carter smiled proudly. Yes. Marcus whispered. She is insane. Mrs. Carter shook her head. No. She pointed upward dramatically. Sometimes respect is earned. Then she pointed to her fake ring. And sometimes respect is accessorized. The room burst into laughter. Mrs. Carter smiled proudly, then adjusted her fake ring and returned to teaching like absolutely nothing had happened.